The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 5, Segment 6, 1960 Presidential Election.
Thanks for tuning in. This segment is on the 1960 general election for president. It involved Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson on the Democratic side, and former Vice President Richard Nixon as the Republican nominee, and a man by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge as his vice presidential candidate on the bottom of the ticket, running against each other. And we could summarize this entire segment relatively quickly in that we could say the mob comes through. With the Kennedy-Johnson ticket approved at the convention, John F. Kennedy's campaign staff quickly realized that it would be fighting an uphill battle to win the presidency. It was difficult enough for JFK to have won the Democratic presidential primaries, overcoming objections to his age, inexperience, Catholic prejudice. But for the general election, Kennedy was running with Johnson as his running mate, and there were even more obstacles. Lyndon Johnson was not well liked by Northern Democrats, particularly union members, because he was from a right-to-work non-union state. And Kennedy also figured that with Johnson on the ballot, rather than Stuart Symington, they were going to lose the large electoral vote in California. Now, with these obstacles, the Kennedy clan retreated to Hyannisport, and with Joe Kennedy offering advice, they developed a three-step plan. The first step was a registration drive to try and get more voters who would vote for Kennedy Johnson. At the end of a 2-month registration drive, they had obtained 6,800,000 new Democrats registered to vote. Also ahead of their time, Kennedy's strategy about scheduling was different than anybody used before. Richard Nixon, who was running against Kennedy, promised to campaign in all 50 states. He was going to spend his months going from state to state. Kennedy decided to spend his time only in those states with the most electoral votes, since that was the key to his victory. In the third part of Kennedy's strategy for the Electoral College was looking at the 50 states and determining which states had the most electoral votes. And there were 9 that could produce 237 out of the 269 electoral votes necessary for Kennedy to win and become president. The Kennedy strategy was to sweep those states, except for California, and essentially ignore all the rest of the states. The opponents to the Kennedy-Johnson ticket were former Vice President under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard M. Nixon, and an elite running mate from Massachusetts named Henry Cabot Lodge. By the summer of 1960, a Gallup poll released found that the Nixon-Lodge ticket was far ahead of Kennedy with a 53% support compared to a 47% support for Kennedy at that time. In order to change things up, Joseph Kennedy made a decision for his son to challenge Richard Nixon to a debate. And for the first time in our nation's history, 2 presidential candidates debated each other on national live television. The first debate was on September 26, 1960, before a television audience of 70 million. When viewers tuned into the debate, they saw Kennedy with a golden tanned look. He looked very healthy. Unfortunately, the glow was from his Addison's disease and the medications he was taking rather than being outdoors and active. Nixon, who had no serious health problems, actually was debating with a serious cold, and he looked sick. So Nixon looked pale and tired, although he was healthy. As the debate went on, Nixon, who was a skilled debater, went point and counterpoint and did all the proper debate techniques. Kennedy, on the other hand, instead of looking at Nixon, talking about the subjects that were brought up, looked and directed his entire attention to the television cameras and the television audience, and with casual self-confidence, he talked to the audience in simple terms. He came across in the debates impressively. With the debates over, Kennedy had closed part of the gap between voters supporting Nixon and himself. And on Election Day on November 8, 1960, as the votes started being counted, it looked like the presidential race was too close to call. The states where Lyndon Johnson had been expected to carry the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, they began to fail miserably. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket suffered especially disappointing losses in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Florida. They also did poorly in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. It appeared that the Southern voters, who usually voted Democratic, were still Bible Belt Protestants and would not vote for a Catholic. As the election night wore on, two of the most critical states in Kennedy's plan were failing: Illinois and Johnson's home state of Texas. Kennedy finally became so concerned that he called Chicago Mayor Richard Daley and told him they had to win Illinois. And in response, Daley contacted mobster Sam Giancana, who in response had his men at work grabbing and seizing Republican ballot boxes and throwing them into the Chicago River, trucking people from poll station to poll station so they could vote numerous times over and over again for John F. Kennedy. Similar tactics occurred in Texas, where more than 100,000 big city votes were simply disqualified, allowing the Kennedy-Johnson ticket to squeak out a razor-thin margin of victory. In the end, the popular vote for Kennedy and Nixon was virtually tied. Kennedy with 49.6% of the votes and Nixon with 49.5% of the votes. Kennedy won by slightly more than 100,000 votes. In Illinois, if an additional 4,500 votes had been counted for Nixon, he would have won. And Nixon would have won Texas if of the 100,000 votes that were discounted had been counted, he would have only needed 25,000 more. The voter irregularity and the corruption was so scandalous in Illinois and in Texas that newspapers, magazines, television networks, and even the Republican Party called it the worst voter fraud in United States presidential history. While it might not have been a pretty victory, the unlikely ticket of Kennedy-Johnson won the White House. Now the crime families who had supported JFK expected Joe Kennedy to deliver on his promises. With the JFK-LBJ win, John F. Kennedy and his dad had secured a president. LBJ had the chance to achieve his dream, at least a chance. And the mob had a man who would protect them, and they also had a backup man in place in case something went wrong. The year 1961 was starting, and for Kennedy, Johnson, and the mob, all seemed right in the world for this happy, although strange, trio. If it were not for the mob taking control of the ballots in both upstate Illinois and in the major cities in Texas, Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson would have never won the 1960 election. They cheated, but that happens all the time in politics. And with that win, Kennedy and Johnson were starting a new, what Kennedy called a new frontier. And it looked like, although the relationship between the two men might have started rocky, and even though Johnson barely won his state while he was on the Kennedy ticket, maybe things would turn out well for the two men together. At least, hopefully, it would turn out better for Johnson than it did for one mobster, and that was Carlos Marcello out of Louisiana. He was deported just months after Kennedy took office. And a lot of people have said that that was the Kennedys going after the mob. Not at that point. The actual reason the Kennedys deported Carlos Marcello went all the way back to the 1960 Democratic National Convention when the mob struck a deal and were going to support Kennedy. Carlos Marcello was the only mob group that wouldn't agree. And he, in the first ballot, with his group out of Louisiana, supported Lyndon Johnson. So once Kennedy took office, they got rid of Carlos. With that said, I hope you're not like Carlos Marcello and you leave for good. I want to see you in the next chapter.